Well, good morning and happy Thursday. We are talking about resumes, in particular, the resume of Jesus. Now, I started beginning this week and I threw a couple fraternity brothers under the bus by noting that they had padded their resumes with references to being members of the D Club, which they hoped was understood to be varsity athletes, but it just meant they got a D in a class. A couple of them got in touch with me and said, wow, cancel culture, you're bringing things back from 30 years ago and dissing me. But one wrote and said, hey, I want it also to be known that I was not only a member of the D Club, I was on the Dean's List. And that also worked the same way. So Dean's List suggests that you have good grades, but there was another Dean's List. It meant that you were in trouble with the Dean. And so they were members of the D Club and on the Dean's List, yes. So we're actually looking at Jesus and these 7 glories or these 7 excellencies, these 7 attributes of Jesus. So they talk about who he is and what he's done. And the first one was that he's the heir of all things, so he's inheriting everything. This is going to end well. The second is he's the creator of all things, and we talked a bit about the fact that that's creation out of nothing, creation ex nihilo. So now we go on, and it says, Jesus, in these last days, previously God spoke to us, to our ancestors through the prophets. In these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God. So we now come to this idea that Jesus is the radiance of God. He's the light of God's splendor. So the first was a statement, the heir of all things. He's a statement about who he is. The second was a statement about what he did. We come back to a statement about who Jesus is. He is the brightness that goes with the light, which obviously these things go together. As we see the sun, the S-U-N, by seeing the sun's rays. We see God, the Father, by seeing God, the Son. And this is an incredible statement about Jesus. Now, a couple things to note. One, it's possible, likely perhaps, that the glory of God is not an attribute per se, as much as it's sort of the expression of all the other attributes, right? It is a reflection of God's goodness and his grace and his love and his power and his wisdom and his holiness, that those things together radiate. Secondly, it's worth noting that radiance can't be transferred, right? It emanates out of something. So we've got a story in Exodus where Moses wants to see God face to face. God says, can't happen, you can't survive, but I'll hide you in the cleft of this rock and I'll move past, and then afterwards you can come out. And that happens, and Moses is then going to reflect God's glory, and his face is going to light up, and he's got to shield his face because no one can look at him. So there's a sense in which Moses could reflect the glory of God, but to actually emanate the glory of God, to radiate, that's something that can only come from God himself. And we get this in other places in Scripture. In John 1, John will write and says, we beheld his glory. He's talking about Jesus. We beheld his glory, the glory of the one and only. So this is an incredible central attribute in that sense of God. Now there's an interesting just little side note to think here. Who's writing this? And how do they know these things? By and large, the New Testament books were written by the apostles, Matthew, John, Peter, Paul, or they were written by people that the apostles had endorsed, Luke, Mark, but we don't know who wrote this. Now, Paul, we think he's talking about himself in 1 Corinthians when he says he knows a man that was called up into heaven and saw things that cannot be described. And John will write in the book of Revelation, he'll write about seeing Jesus exalted. And so we've got the apostles seeing the post-resurrection Christ. It's part of the attribute of being an apostle. We don't know who wrote this. So it's just interesting how did they gain this insight, the whole inspiration of Scripture. But let me just make 2 quick points here. What's the reason for this passage? Well, first of all, the more we know about Jesus, the easier it is to worship him. The easier it is to yield to him. The easier it is to follow. The more we know, the more we marvel, the more we line up. Secondly, the more we know about Christ, the easier it is to persevere. The easier it is to suffer. And my take, last week, people are getting tired, a little snarky. My email box would suggest people are getting a little snarky and a little weary of what's going on. And I get that. Open, closed, mask, no mask, this, that, it's getting old. But the more we know about Jesus and what awaits, the easier it is to be people of love and grace and mercy to others. So think today about the radiance of Jesus. Have a good day.